Hi everyone, and welcome to our IAPP Legacy event. My name's Therese. I'm one of your new Sydney IAPP chapter chairs and also your co-host for today. Before commencing, and in the spirit of reconciliation, the IAPP and hosts acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. We pay our respects to the elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here with us today. Foremostly, the IAPP would like to thank Tim de Souza and also the FTI Consulting team for kindly hosting us in their Sydney office today and also live streaming today's event. For those of you who aren't familiar with the IAPP, and I might just try and drive this. PowerPoint.
Is that not working? There you go.
Here we go. For those of you who aren't part of the IAPP and curious as to what we are, the IAPP is the International Association of Privacy Professionals. It is the largest and most comprehensive global information privacy resource, helping practitioners develop and advance their careers in organizations manage and protect their data. As we slowly approach our 21st, I think it is, anniversary, we are coming close to 70,000 members in over 100 countries. For those of you curious to learn more, feel free to jump on the IAPP website, which is iapp.org, to check out any further resources, up-to-date news on privacy, as well as information on training, certification, and upcoming events. Now, the reason why we are all here today, the Consent Track, Australian focus groups on smartphones, privacy and consent, is a research project written and researched by Dr. Sacha Molitorisz and Dr. James Meese and funded by the IAPP. Now, to tell you a little bit more about our researchers, Sacha is a lecturer at the Centre of Media Transition at the University of Technology, Sydney. He recently wrote and published Net Privacy, How We Can Be Free in an Age of Surveillance, has co-authored commissioned reports for bodies including the ACCC and ACPA, and his academic work has been published in leading journals such as Media International Australia and Journalism, as well as The Conversation. Sacha is the convener lecturer of the Global Media course at NYU Sydney and has previously spent 20 years on staff at the SMH as writer, editor, and blogger. Now, James is a senior lecturer at RMIT University. He holds an early career research fellowship from the Australian Research Council and is currently co-editing an edited collection with Sarah Bannerman on the algorithmic distribution of news. His research interests include media and telecommunications policy, artificial intelligence, and intellectual property. He has authored 2 books, and he has also published work in a variety of leading journals. Sacha and James, thank you very much for joining us today, and I might hand the floor over to you to walk us through the research.
Just before you do that, if I could just
absolutely.
Say it's my great pleasure and FTI's pleasure to be hosting this event, and also my pleasure as a former member of IAPP ANZ's board to see this research actually hit the public. IAPP ANZ was the predecessor to IAPP in Australia. We were the Australia New Zealand chapter of the IAPP before IAPP Global merged us into the organization. And so in 2018, when that merger happened, we still had some money left over on our accounts, and we wanted to use that money to benefit the privacy community in general. And so this series of grants, of which this research was one of the recipients, was born. So as a former member of the IAPP board and the current member of the IAPP ANZ board and a current member of the IAPP ANZ advisory board, yikes. It's my great pleasure to both have been part of funding this research and to have the opportunity to host its launch. So James and Sacha, really happy to see this research, really enjoyed it myself because I'm a giant nerd. And look forward to seeing your presentation. So thank you very much. And yeah, please proceed.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Therese. And thank you very much, Tim. And thanks to FTI for hosting this event in this bizarre in-person virtual format, this hybrid format that we've all, I guess, become accustomed to. and which has significant impacts on privacy. You know, the fact that we're using Zoom, the fact that I'm in my living room, in my house, which is traditionally a private space, and yet we're in this public or semi-public forum that we're having tonight. You know, all these privacy issues have really, a lot of them have really been brought out over the past 12 months. Thank you very much to FTI. Thank you to the IAPP. I'll say that right at the outset, for funding this research. You know, James and I came up with the idea for this research late 2019, I think it was. And it was just the idea of bringing together consent, privacy, and smartphones, you know, just doing something quite specific, hosting some focus groups. And just while I was thinking about tonight, this afternoon, an email landed in my inbox from UTS, where I work, and it said, "Why consent always matters. There's no better time to reflect on our ideas of consent and respectful relationships," the email was about. So clearly it was referencing what we're reading in the news at the moment, you know, consent in the context of gender relations, sexual abuse, and so on, you know, these serious issues that we're seeing play out in Canberra. But as far as I'm concerned, and I think James is concerned, you know, consent is this really important, fascinating ethical mechanism and legal mechanism as well that justifies certain behavior and doesn't justify other behavior. So that was kind of the genesis of this research. And as I dive into it, I also want to acknowledge very deeply the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, where I am, on whose lands I currently am. You know, that's something else about this time. We're all on lands that are so dispersed, and I think it's more important than ever to acknowledge that. Okay, so this is our, if I can drive, let's see, yes, it is working. There we go. That was the report. So I'll start with this little, just a quick run through something very personal. So imagine you want to leave a social network, right? It should be easy in theory, right? It should be a case of taking back the consent you previously gave. Here's what happens if you try to leave Facebook. It's quite straightforward. Your account is scheduled for permanent deletion. Right? That sounds fine. It's going to be deleted in 30 days. And in some jurisdictions, there's a law there that will back up people's ability to withdraw consent. So in Europe, you know, as many people here might know, Article 7 of the GDPR, the privacy protection, the general data privacy regulation, Article 7 says it shall be as easy to withdraw as to give consent, right? So you'd think it should be as easy to get off as not. But I was just doing this quite recently, and on my phone, I can't actually take the Facebook app off the phone. It's just inbuilt into the architecture of the phone. I recently got a new phone, and this is the old phone. It's just there, right? So I've disabled it, but it's still there. This is hardly a really massive or significant instance, but I just use it as illustrative of the way that consent intuitively seems to be something very important, and the ability to withdraw it would seem to be very important. And in the way that digital data is used these days, it doesn't really often work like that in practice. So that was the kind of intuition that started us on our research. So what did we do? We had 4 in-person focus groups. No, wait a second, COVID-19. We had 6 Zoom focus groups, right? So the research took a little longer than we anticipated. Just when we were ready to go with 4 in-person focus groups, we had to switch to Zoom. But Zoom and COVID also gave us some opportunities, because we could, for one thing, we could talk about the COVID Safe app and people's experiences of consenting to that. That was quite interesting. But also we could have the discussions around what I've just been talking about. So Zoom, you know, the fact that I was in my living room, James was in his house. And there were certain there were privacy issues going on with Zoom in those early days of Zoom bombing, and various other things that I'm sure you read stories about. So we conducted 3 focus groups in Coffs Harbour, 3 focus groups in Sydney. We just wanted to get a bit of a blend of regional and urban and metropolitan, and just to see what sort of differences there were. 26 participants altogether. They were held, our focus groups, in July 2020. Sydney and Coffs Harbour, I've already said, and we took a co-design approach. And by that, really, this qualitative research, we wanted to be as open to what the participants had to contribute as possible without leading them or priming them, right? So really, we were trying to be as open-ended as possible. James and I, having researched in this area quite a lot previously, we certainly have strong opinions, and we have, but we tried to put them all to one side, and we tried to let the participants tell us what they thought and what they wanted. And we just listened, you know, above all. One of the things we did, apart from just talking, so we spent a lot of time talking, asking questions like, what is privacy? Why does privacy matter to you? And then going into consent quite specifically, then showing screenshots of the COVID Safe app and the consent process. Apps like Tinder or signing up for Facebook or Google, certain Google products. And then we also jumped over to Jamboard, which is a Google product where it's, if you're not familiar with it, I guess it's something like a big collaborative whiteboard that you all have access to at the same time. So the participants could put Post-it notes on this whiteboard, or that was the main thing we did. We would have discussions, and they would put Post-it notes there, and they would address certain questions. And the benefit of that was that the participants weren't just sitting around talking. And we know that some people are more shy than others. Some people can express themselves better in writing. So, you know, this is just an example of one of the responses that we had written down. It is a leap of faith every time. That was from a 52-year-old in Coffs Harbour, and all the names have been changed. So they're all pseudonyms. Oops. Let's see if I can go backward a bit. All right, so there we go. Maddie. There we go. Well, I think I just jumped the slide, which was from Maddie, but that's all right. I'll come back to that. So one of our participants was from Sydney. Her name was Maddie. She was in her 30s. And her line was that she came up with halfway through one of the focus groups in Sydney was, consent is like a trap. And this really stuck with us, with both James and me, because it seemed to encapsulate that consent is fundamentally flawed at the moment. There's a real fundamental problem with consent. But they kept coming back to the point that they wanted consent to work, and they think it can work. So they then, pressing our participants further, getting them to contribute more on the Jamboard, on the collaborative exercises, they came up with certain prescriptions for what consent should look like. They said consent should be simple. I mean, these sound like fairly elementary components, but they're quite powerful actually. And they expressed they expanded on these points, as you can see if you read the report. Consent should be simple, should be clear, logical, targeted, so specific. Shouldn't just be scattergun and broad. It should be relevant to what is being requested. And it should be real world. So there should be real concrete examples to bring it to life, right? When you put those things together, you start to get you start to fill in a really good picture of what consent should look like, according to our participants. Participants said consent should also be sensitive to vulnerable groups. This came up again and again. And in fact, on that point, one of our participants from Coffs Harbour, she had clearly come to our focus group wanting to tell her story. And her story was all about being someone who had experienced very significant domestic violence. So for her, she was in an abusive relationship. She left and she relocated. And then unfortunately, what happened was, through the social media, not of herself or her friends, but her family and friends, completely by accident, perhaps what they were sharing in the background, her ex-partner tracked down her and her kids again. And she was forced, after more violence, to relocate a second time. So that took us by surprise, and it very much brought home that we're not just talking about some theoretical issue here. You know, for at least this one participant, privacy was very much an issue of personal safety, the safety of herself and her kids. And she was adamant that companies, that governments, that all the people who deal in our data have to stick to the things that they say they're going to stick to. So again and again, we heard consent needs to be sensitive to vulnerable groups, needs to be sensitive to how people use tech. For instance, they share phones, to smartphone characteristics, needs to be sensitive to the fact that if an app changes, then the consent needs to be reobtained. It needs to be time limited, and it needs to be easily withdrawn, right? So that gets back to a point I raised right at the outset. So back to this quote from Maddie, we pushed her on this thing that she said, this quote, consent is a trap, but she then added to it later in that same session. She said it's still useful. It's a tool somehow to protect ourselves as well. If it can be made more simple, that's better, but it's better than nothing. So there was this recognition that consent really matters. Yeah, it's busted, but it can be fixed and we want it fixed. So this then brings us to the law. There was this fundamental, deep recognition on the part of many participants that consent is important, that it can be fixed, and they believe that companies can fix it, that governments can fix it so that it's effective. But even if we make consent as good as it can be, the individual in a digital context will never be sufficiently empowered for consent to be the end of the story. The law is going to have to play a key role. So participants said consent isn't enough to protect privacy on its own. Here's a quote, too hard on the individual level. It has to be policy-based rather than individual-based. That was from Rosie, a 42-year-old from Coffs Harbour. And here, another quote, with vulnerable groups, the law has a really big role. So that recognition came through as well. That was from Ellie, a 19-year-old in Sydney. And one of the suggestions, because they did then, these 26 participants, you know, we were delighted and impressed with the richness of their responses. You know, this was clearly something they think about and they have solutions for. You know, they weren't, most of them weren't tech experts or lawyers or anything like that. They were just regular people who engaged with digital platforms and digital services all the time, as most of us do. And so they thought about this, they thought about what they care about and how things might be better. So one suggestion was for a mandatory standardized privacy rating scheme. That was one suggestion among many. So something like a restaurant ratings scheme, a health scheme. You know, the first thing you see as you walk in through the door of a restaurant is the sanitation rating or the cleanliness rating. And that really holds the restaurant accountable. If there was something similar where we would both be educated as a consumer, but also where companies would be held accountable for the integrity of their data policies, I think that would really help clear certain things up a bit. So that was a suggestion from Olive, a 25-year-old from Sydney. And we came, James and I, to frame the law as a form of collective consent, in fact. I mean, that's another whole large topic that we can get into in the discussion if you like. But this is something that I wrote about in the book as well, where we can think of individual consent, and then we can bolster that with the collective consent of the law. And as I say, we can expand on that if that's something that people want to hear more about. The sticking points for the law, of course, and there are many, but here are some that emerged from our discussions. You know, inferred data. How do we deal with inferred data? How do we deal with the stuff that a company, a social network can work out about us, but that we haven't actually shared, but they just can work out because of the suburb I live in and the friends I have, right? So this is an enormous phenomenon that we know is happening now with big data, with the volumes of data being collected. How can the law deal with this? Well, that's still an open question. And in the privacy law review that's going on at the moment, I think this is one of the trickiest. Shadow profiles, you know, that's a related issue. This is something we put to our participants. So, you know, you have 4 friends, you have 5 friends, say. 4 of them are on a social network, the 5th isn't. That social network can still have a profile of that 5th person because of all, that person might be in the background of photos or because of the inferred data I just mentioned, you know. So how does the law deal with that? That's arguably an easier issue. And then relational privacy. I guess this is a little hobby horse of mine. You know, this idea that privacy matters for us as individuals, but in fact, it's actually something that matters for us in relationships. Privacy is actually something that we share with others and have with others at times. You know, it's part of what makes my relationship with my wife or my kids special, because we have certain things that are private to us. And relational privacy, or other theorists use terms such as collective privacy, networked privacy. We see that very clearly on the internet. And I think that is what we need to work out how to protect and how the law can then protect. And that's really tough. The answers are not clear. And with that, I'd love to hand over to James.
Thanks, Sacha. So before I get started, I just want to also express my thanks to FTI Consulting for hosting this event, and to IAPP and the previous iteration, IAPP ANZ, for their support of our project. And I'm here today to talk about UX and UI. So the other thing we spoke to our participants about is about the way that smartphones actually work. And I think that's kind of a really important transformation that often doesn't get much sort of recognition. The idea that more and more of our consumption of digital media is occurring on these really small devices. And in a way, this was almost the partially the inspiration for our project, that it's, in a way, you know, obviously informed consent is still difficult when you're dealing with a desktop screen, but that becomes infinitely harder when dealing with, you know, a reasonably small iPhone or Android phone. So the way we kind of got through that was using these industry terms. So for those who aren't familiar, and many of you I'm sure are, user experience is the actual experience of a person going through and using an app or a kind of platform. And user interface relates to the presentation of that platform, so how that design is actually realized. So one thing that we found from our discussion is that our participants were quite au fait with how tech companies engage with design to limit, you know, positive privacy options, we might call them. So what we've got here is one of the more, I guess, compelling reports around what we call dark patterns, which is tech companies using design in particular ways to, as it states there, discouraging us from exercising our rights to privacy. So that was done by the Norwegian Consumer Council. So there are a range of ways that this might occur. This might occur through deceptive click flows, through nudging, through hidden defaults, or through a lack of granular choices. So, you know, these are a range of ways on smartphones in particular, but not exclusively to smartphones, that our consumers recognize that they might be disadvantaged when it came to exercising informed consent. I might get you to move on, Sacha. Yeah, but just to you know, bolster what Sacha said, we took real inspiration from the work of Ryan Calo, who wrote this wonderful paper in 2011. There's obviously been some criticism of informed consent, and for good reason. But as Sacha's already alluded to, one thing we didn't want to do is throw the baby out with the bathwater, and that was really bolstered when we got responses back from our participants who made it clear that even though consent was broken, they saw some value in it. And clearly we saw some value in terms of transparency, but also in terms of accountability. They thought that was really important as well. And one thing that Ryan says there, really to get down to it, is have we really tried anything else? You know, obviously we know that the click and flick, or the you know, that we're not going to read this TNC and just move forward, is common today still. But you know, we started to get thinking about design, started talking to our participants, and our participants gave us ideas about design and ways we could move forward. I should mention at this point, we were also really well supported by Jenny Hagedorn, who's an PhD in design, and she gave us some really great insights on, you know, from the design world, what some of the challenges are in UX and UI, from corporate pressures to a lack of conversation between, say, programmers, designers, and whether it's outside legal experts or in-house counsel. These kind of tensions between these different areas, leading to, in the worst case scenario, things like dark patterns. When it came to UX and UI, we had some great, a series of quotes from participants. If I could prompt you, Sacha, to bring up the other, sorry, that basically put the onus back on companies. And I think, obviously, when we're thinking about companies, our minds might turn to Google and Facebook. But we might also think about Australian companies like Woolworths or Coles with Flybuys and Woolworths Rewards, or some of our major banks, basically recognizing that these are multi-million-dollar entities, in many cases bringing in profit or at least substantive revenue. And our consumers, as consumers, were relatively unconvinced by the inability of companies to, as Natasha says, explain complex things in simple terms. Olive, who has previous experience in healthcare, noted that clearly informed consent has come from the healthcare space and from the medical space, particularly medical research. And she said, she's had experience in simplifying informed consent. So when thinking about smartphones, when thinking about engagement with these new technologies, there was a strong sense from our participants that, we can actually put some money behind this. And maybe this is something that, companies actually need to invest in. So, and what I love about this project is, of course, they came up with a series of solutions. So when one issue we noted through our workflows, and as Sacha kind of pointed out, we actually got our participants to walk through signing up to a series of different apps. So what this really was a kind of collective critique of a range of different informed consent processes for, a series of corporate apps, as well as the COVID Safe app from government. So one issue we noted was that people weren't forced to read the terms and conditions on certain, apps. So options were being forced to scroll through a summary, ticking a box, or answering a short quiz. Another issue was the fact that has been flagged before, that it's an all or nothing bargain. So Sacha's already spoken about the possibility of granular consent, and there was really quite, in the design context, some quite clever suggestions about the way in which people might be able to select certain things they wanted to hand over and not select, or be given reminders, whether that's because of a change or simply to just ask if they wanted to continue the practice of handing over certain amounts of data. And an interesting proposition to test apps before kind of signing on the bottom line, saying, well, I don't actually know what this app does. In many cases, you're literally passing through the T's and C's before you even see the internal workings of this app. So potential design mechanism to give consumers some sort of forewarning. But what I think, and what was really compelling for me, is we're still running on this kind of quite contractual, legalistic approach to terms and conditions, and for good reason. It is a kind of contractual document. But what consumers really wanted and really engaged with were, as our participants said in the previous slide, just more simpler ways of understanding what was happening with their data. Videos, pop-ups, pictures, real life scenarios where they would take the time to, if not on sign up, at least at certain points throughout their life, particularly for a service which they might use regularly, engage with the context in which this data is being handled. And it was evident to many of them, and indeed evident from our research, that what we might call a user-facing or consumer-facing approach to informed consent wasn't really present. So we might also I guess getting a bit speculative, and a lot of this stuff is not in the report, but it kind of we kind of touch on it, and we start thinking about the potential futures for informed consent, because I think, as Sacha has noted, there are a range of developments on the horizon, or indeed happening at the moment, which mean that individual consent, despite all of these potential changes, may not be relevant for a range of different use cases. As Sacha says, and as we kind of recommend in our report, at certain points we need to make social decisions about how data gets used and in what context. Just to hit the three buzzwords one after the other. We have automated decision making, or what some people might know as artificial intelligence. That leads into things like smart cities, and the rollout of things like 5G is likely to bring about a boost, a step change in infrastructure and speed. So as noted, there is a potential for kind of governance over consent, but I think as well we might want to think about the ways in which we can think beyond law as well. And in many cases, it might be less about law, and I think more appropriately, just as appropriately rather, for an organisation like IAPP, it might be about practice and about the ways in which industry and consumers engage. So one project that's starting to do this in the commercial real estate business, very much looking towards the future of ADM and smart cities and 5G, and I should disclose that I'm providing some support to this project, is doing that from an industry focus, and looking at the privacy concerns and risks to companies. And if I could just prompt you, Sacha, to click one more time, it leads me to think that one other way of thinking about this for companies, particularly companies that might be unwilling to invest in this space, or not motivated to engage substantively in whether it's more specific issues around informed consent or broader issues looking ahead, is thinking about the risks to companies. So, treating it as a kind of environmental, social, etc. risk that can be mitigated for. And obviously that's not the most positive way of looking at it. Companies should be doing some work here, because it's a positive social outcome to protect people's data. But there are other kind of ways of framing this as an issue that would encourage companies to take notice. So yeah, if we come to our key recommendations now, as we've kind of noted throughout, we think there's room to repair informed consent. There's room to, purely for the notice component, I think, provide transparency to people about what they're doing, provide some accountability for companies. But particularly, I think in the smartphone space, just to hone in on that, I think what we found is that there are some real difficulties. And, if we can think, I can't quite see my screen, but if you can just see my smartphone here, one thing that came out of our data is that we just use smartphones a lot in a very casual fashion. Desktops and laptops still have this kind of modicum of a sense that I'm doing work. We might be slightly more conscious when we're using these technologies. And one thing that came through with our data was that smartphones just were a completely different UX UI component in terms of that experience of using a smartphone. Another interesting development was, we had some older people in that, some focus groups as well. And even simple things like eyesight or navigation presented real concerns for some of those people. So, maybe skipping the down to the third point there, design is key, particularly when we start talking about smartphones. It's not an add-on, it's not an optional extra. It's not just, copying a contract from a piece of paper to a desktop. It's really a holistic approach to how we're serving information to people. But obviously, and I think as becomes increasingly evident, there are going to be scenarios where, and I'm sure we'll talk about in the panel discussion, with the emergence of the privacy law reform issues paper, there is going to be a need for the law to grapple with some of these more, whether we call them edge cases or just the broader social context which we're operating in. So, yeah, and this is our kind of final hurrah that, law and design is kind of so we can treat people as people. And, we have to recognize that a lot of our current consent mechanisms around privacy are based in a broader economic structure based around, whether we call it data broking or something else. We've honed the economic component of these applications and services, and now it's really time to do some work on the social component. So that's us, and thank you so much for coming along.
Fantastic. Thanks very much, Sacha and James, for running through your research project with us. I think while unsurprising that your participants found consent to be broken, I think it was quite exciting and quite empowering that they do indeed value it and want to see it improved. I guess to delve into that a little bit further, I'll bring Tim back into the conversation and also another special guest, Amanda Khoo from Brisbane.
Therese, just before we move on, we do have a question from the floor regarding Sacha and James's presentation.
Of course.
So this comes from Malcolm Crompton from Information Integrity Solutions. Are the issues here raised about consent in Australia an issue with the wording of the law, including the guidelines, or its enforcement? Specifically, the APP guidelines on consent are very clear about the preconditions for consent. It has to be informed, voluntary, current, and specific, and they have to have the capability of consent. And the guidelines are also specific about the ability to withdraw that consent. So when you were speaking to the participants, did they perceive an issue with Australian constructions of consent, or was it consent in the way that it is imposed by the industry?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. It's great to have you in the room, Malcolm. I know how respected you are in this field and what you've done for privacy in Australia. Yes, the participants were aware of the complexity of the issue. They did recognise the Australian focus and also that there are jurisdictional issues here. This is one of the great problems the law has to wrestle with, and we all have to wrestle with. Great if we have some Australian solutions in the law, but what happens with this thing that's the internet that actually isn't just in Australia, it's all around the world, right? And yes, there was this recognition about enforcement as well. And, I think James would agree with me that a large part of the problem here is that, say, the Office of the Australian Information Commissioner, the Privacy Commissioner, is underfunded, lacks the resources to prosecute breaches of the Privacy Act. So that's something that, certainly I believe very strongly that needs to be addressed in the current law reform. But yes, our participants were surprisingly, they weren't generally across the details of the law, but they recognised that there just wasn't much happening in terms of enforcing legal privacy protections. I don't know, James, if you wanted to add anything to that.
Well, the only thing I'd add to that, and likewise, it's really great to have you here, Malcolm, and it's great to have your contributions to this conversation, considering you've forgotten more about privacy than I'll ever learn. I think the other thing to note is obviously we can't expect everyday Australians to pay particular interest to the legalities around privacy, but what was telling is when we presented to them recent, kind of current definitions around consent as the law currently understood it, these were seen to be quite reasonable. So, obviously, and just following up with Sacha, there are issues with enforcement, but it seemed from our discussions that there was a general sense from, the community that we spoke to, the way that consent is construed in Australian law seemed to be reasonable to them. And I know, Sacha, you were more leading those discussions around the relationship between their knowledge of the law and, et cetera, et cetera.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Sacha and James, for chiming in. Just a little quick intro, just to bring Tim back into the conversation, and also another special guest, Amanda Khoo, who joins us from Brisbane, who'll be joining us on the panel today. Just to give you a little intro on both, So Amanda is the head of legal of financial services company Gallantree, and she is also a lawyer at Mills Oakley. Her primary focus is on fintech and regtech, acting as the bridge between the banking and financial services industry and the digital world, with experience advising on global privacy laws, ISO certification, cybersecurity, and the new consumer data right regime. Amanda is also an author and contributor to the LexisNexis Financial Services newsletter and the LexisNexis Australian Banking and Finance Law Bulletin, and regularly lectures on her passion, fintechs and regtechs, to university students. Tim, as many of you know, is a senior director with FTI Consulting and a member of IAPP's ANZ Advisory Board. He is a strategic and operational privacy expert with a focus on emerging technologies. Tim has held senior privacy and digital transformation roles with Westpac, the CBA, the New South Wales Government Department of Customer Service, and the OAIC. In 2019, Tim established the New South Wales Government Policy Lab, Australia's first whole-of-government human-centred policy design lab. And in 2020, he was listed in the apolitical World Economic Forum's Agile 50 as one of the world's 50 most influential people revolutionising government for his work in digital transformation and rules as code. Welcome to you both.
Thanks
Great.
very much.
Lovely to be here.
Now, I think, and in line with one of the report's key recommendations of better governance, and as we aptly touched on just in your last point, Sacha and James, I think an appropriate starting point for today's conversation would be an exploration of Australia's current privacy regime and the imminent privacy reforms. So over to you guys. What are we currently doing? What could we be doing? What could we be doing better?
I'm happy to take this one first. So really briefly, this is a review that's being led by the Attorney General. And, they've received a number of submissions and it relates to the state of privacy law and the privacy landscape at the moment within Australia. And, the submissions relate to a couple of recommendations off the back of the Digital Inquiries report. So that was kind of the report that caused a lot of debate and I think hoo-ha around Facebook and Google. And they had a couple of recommendations around that, and the Attorney General has launched this review into the Privacy Act reform off the back of it. In terms of what's coming from the review, just overarchingly, I think one of the main goals from, going through the submissions as well as going through the paper itself, it's very much about bringing Australia in line with international standards as well. In particular, I think it relates really to the GDPR, which currently is the gold standard for privacy. It's something that would greatly assist a lot of companies, especially those with international and global footprints, to be able to just kind of align themselves and their policies when they're within Australia with their policies when they're in Europe or all over the world. So that's a big piece. And off the back of the research that James and Sacha were presenting on, which was excellent research, by the way, guys, very interesting. I think the research ties in perfectly with this reform because there are a lot of mentions around consent and, whether in terms of the way companies are approaching privacy at the moment with the APP, with the APP guidelines, is that something that aligns with expectations at the moment? Is this the best way moving forward? Should we update the scheme? Should we change the way data breaches are notified? What about the way people nowadays are accessing information and companies themselves are accessing information? So I think that's kind of an overarching review of it. With the nature of consent, the question is whether really is a tick the box solution enough now, when you're preparing, when you have a privacy policy that's being released to the general public, do you want to, is it best practice? And I do think best practice is really, James, as you said, privacy by design. You just have to start from the very beginning and just incorporate privacy all the way through, have that at the forefront of your mind, because it just, whilst it may be slightly more costly at the beginning, it pays off, I think, all the way through at the very end, because you don't have to worry about all the other finicky things along the way. So that's briefly what I have to say. Tim, James, Sacha?
Yeah, one of the things I find myself telling clients is there is actually a very large gap between what you're required to do under the law and what your users, your customers actually expect of you.
Yeah.
The Privacy Act, as it currently stands, sets out a baseline, and that is very helpful and good because regulated entities need certainty. But it's become increasingly clear over the last 5 to 10 years that users expect more than just minimum compliance. They want to have trusted relationships with the companies that they engage with the government agencies that they engage with. And to build those trusted relationships, you need to go well above and beyond minimum compliance. And so privacy by design is part of that. You're building in user expectations and catering to those user expectations in the design of your product. It's really, really important. And I often use consent as a privacy by design example, because we've evolved a system where we are increasingly using privacy policies as liability shields, trying to put out these voluminous documents that are often somewhere in the range of 5,000 words that convey every possible prospective use of data. And that's not what they're meant to be used for. It's not supposed to be a set and forget scenario. It's meant to be an instrument of transparency. It's meant to accurately convey to a user what you're collecting, why you're collecting it, and how you're using it. And those kinds of messages don't need to be 5,000 words long or 40,000 words long in the case of certain policies that I've seen recently. They can actually be very pithy. They can be 2 or 3 short sentences that are displayed just in time, delivering the information when you need to know it and allowing you to make informed decisions at that time. Sure, it can be backed up by a longer document, a policy document. I don't think we're getting away from those anytime soon, but we can add easier to use layers and we can deliver that information in a more timely fashion.
Yeah, and if I can just jump in there, I think the other important thing, and obviously I framed this around risk at one point during the presentation, but there are benefits in those trusted relationships. We're obviously relying on more data. Data can be useful for governments, can be useful for businesses, and there's a sense at which if we can raise this bar together, there might be a way in which people are more comfortable handing over certain categories of information that potentially benefit the consumer and the company or government. So there's kind of a two-way relationship there that could really work out and support both parties. It's not about not handing over any information at all. But as you say, Tim and Amanda, you've kind of pointed to where we're at baseline standards now. And there's also just a lot of unanswered questions really in the landscape, whether it's the role of small businesses that are currently not covered by the Privacy Act, or the definition of personal information that might not quite cover all the kind of data that's circulating around at the moment, or even the role of the privacy safeguards under the consumer data right that operate in parallel to the APP principles. So it's quite a messy space. And I guess for me, I'm hoping that the issues paper, in a sense, provides some clarity, not just to consumers, but obviously to professionals working in this space, and, really sets the stage for the next 10 years going forward.
I think so. And I mean, we're looking at the sheer scale of problems that are that's trying to be addressed at the moment. It's very difficult. I mean, I appreciate that it's a huge live growing issue. You have to look at human rights, you have to look at risk, and the environment at the moment. So I totally agree. And I think in relation to what you mentioned earlier, James, to, about shadow profiling as well. I think that's something that is really interesting, because I would imagine, and I have read some submissions, particularly from the larger corporations that are pushing back on that, because obviously they're using that data for their commercial interests. And if we start, and if the Privacy Act starts limiting that within Australia, well then, that kind of creates barriers to their different avenues for revenue.
Yeah,
that is actually, if I'll just jump in on that point, because that's such a fascinating point. Shadow profiles are just fascinating to me, and so that is something we specifically put to people in the focus groups, and they were horrified by that prospect. So we told them, we gave them a scenario such as the one I gave earlier, where you've got 5 friends, 4 of them are on some sort of social network, and the 5th one isn't. What do we think about this fact of the 5th one having this shadow profile, this hidden profile, because there's enough data about that person to do that? And people were horrified. They said, they used words like, unethical, illegal. They were outraged, basically. So, and it is very clearly a failure of consent. How can someone consent to being profiled when they don't even know, they might not even know that company exists, right? They've deliberately chosen not to be on it, or they don't even know about it. So, I mean, that to me is a really fascinating issue, and our participants were very clear. So it's an interesting discussion.
Definitely.
The modern regulation of privacy is ultimately about choice and control. And in the shadow profile context, you are providing neither of those things. You cannot control a profile that you know exists. And by having it created without your knowledge or your consent, you're removing that choice. So it's certainly a very problematic practice.
I was just going to add to that, Tim, and just say that it also goes to, earning the trust of your consumers. Once they learn that these shadow profiles are being created, that really does affect the relationship and, I guess, the PR value of the company. So that's something as well that companies need to take into consideration.
And one of the foundational principles in creating these kinds of trusted relationships is no surprises. Like if you're doing something that somebody
over communicate,
then if you're collecting information that people didn't expect was being collected, or you're using it in an unexpected way, then you've shattered that relationship, and they will not trust you. So it's more than just covering your liabilities in a long, voluminous contractual document. You actually have to effectively communicate how you're using that information, and that's a much harder challenge.
Yeah, I think so.
Absolutely, and I think that's also where the law is going to need to have a form of recognition, in terms of the recognition of privacy as a collective rather than as an individual. I mean, when you think about the greatest amount of value that comes from data, it's in the form of its aggregation, not in its individual form. And so I think that's where the recognition needs to take that little step further. Absolutely. I'm cognizant of time, so I might just throw in another question if I can, unless there's anything else on the chat that's popped up.
We did start 5 minutes late because we wanted to make sure that everybody had time to join. So we could go a further 5 minutes and end it.
Also, I do think Rianne has a question.
Oh, great.
Fantastic. Go ahead.
So Rianne's question is that of the alternatives to the consent model discussed today, a privacy rating system seems the most immediately appealing. However, would it not run into problems of subjectivity, unlike with a restaurant hygiene rating, to borrow the example? Privacy standards are not strictly objective, and privacy harms are hard to quantify. And if not, how can such a rating system be structured so that it is more than mere compliance with the law? It's a very good question.
Yeah, I might start with that if you don't mind, Amanda.
Yeah, of course.
One of the things that we're seeing now is kind of the concept of a privacy trust mark. So like a tick that you can put on your website that's been given to you by some authority. In many cases, that authority tends to be like the national regulator. So for example, the PDPA in Singapore has a privacy trust mark scheme whereby they will allow you to assess yourself and submit an application proving that you meet baseline requirements of their privacy legislation. And if they agree, they will authorize you to use this privacy trust mark on your website. that's pretty rudimentary as rating systems go. It's either, yes, we've got a trust mark, or no, we don't. And in any case, the trust mark, what it indicates is that you comply with the law, which frankly should be a baseline requirement anyway. You shouldn't have to have a special badge that says that that's the case. But we're starting to see some jurisdictions put in place this kind of rating system in its most basic form. You do have to wonder to what extent that you can have a rating spectrum, because the law by necessity provides a baseline, and you either comply with that baseline or you don't. There generally are gradations above that point where you comply even more. So I suppose we could start looking at possibilities for meeting best practice above and beyond what the law requires, but we start to run into those questions of subjectivity then.
Yeah, look, I'll just jump in very quickly there. I think absolutely it is a real issue, the subjectivity of those calls, which is a great company, which is a great practice. But, I approach most of these questions from an ethical perspective first. That's kind of my starting point. That was the way I got into thinking about privacy in the first place. And time and again, when you're getting into these tricky areas, things get really tough. But just because something's tough, just because something's hard, doesn't mean it's impossible. It doesn't mean you can't do it. So I'm sure there's no perfect way to do this, but I'm sure there are really good ways to do this. However you constitute a regulator or a panel to determine what sort of ratings we give and how we give them, it will necessarily be imperfect, but we can make it really good, and we can make it so that it's really useful for people, and we can make it meaningful so that companies take notice of it and government departments take notice of it, and it has a real impact in basically just improving practice, making best practice better practice, or at the moment bad practice, making bad practice good practice.
So the purpose of the rating system, then, just to give an example, is to promote more of a punitive factor. Taking the restaurant scenario as an example, I don't really care if the restaurant is rated high or medium. I do care if it's rated low. And I would avoid that because it's rated low, similar to like you didn't pass the baseline mark. So it becomes more of a punitive factor for the restaurant to not have surpassed at least the minimum threshold.
Yeah.
So is that what we're looking for here, is you failed the test, you need to improve according to the normal standards. So therefore, that's what we're trying to achieve, better privacy regulations.
Yeah, there is a risk in all rating system where you have 5 stars, I will use that. 4 stars, oh God, this place is a rat infested hellhole, I'm never going there. Rating systems are not always taken by the users as they are intended by the raters. So that is a risk. But yeah, I mean, we'd have to work through those questions if we try to implement that kind of system. Right now, I'm not optimistic that a rating system outside of the usual kind of Yelp crowdsourced ratings model is likely to come from any sort of official source. You're either going to get a thumbs up or a thumbs down, but no gradations in between. Anybody else want to weigh in on that one?
Oh, just a quick sidebar. I just note from the question as well that there's kind of a comment about the subjectivity of harms as well. And I think that that's kind of true. And I think, the rate of technological change has happened so quickly. We are dealing with an exponential kind of development of the kind of harms that can occur from privacy. And I think, it's probably right to say that some of these harms have not yet been well conceptualized or rigorously thought through from a kind of, legal concepts perspective. And there's a really great, it's very academic and dry, but two good scholars, Daniel Citron and Daniel Solove in the US, have just done a really great kind of rigorous and systematic outlining of harms of privacy. And I think, it can't come soon enough, because in a way, there's been a lot of diagnostics of the problems, but problems aren't necessarily direct harms. And I think, again, it's a sidebar to the ratings discussion, but more broadly, getting some more certainty around these harms, particularly in big data environments, smart city environments, etc. These are still quite speculative, and I think some more rigor as that emerges, whether it's from professional practice, the courts, or from academia, will be really useful in thinking about, what sort of regulatory interventions come next.
Yeah. One of the difficulties with assessing harm in data-driven spaces is that the harms tend to be intersectional. They're not just going to be, oh, well, this person's at additional risk of financial harm because of identity theft, or this person's at risk of reputational harm. The kinds of data that we're seeing being compromised, the breadth of data that we're seeing being compromised, means that harms are going to be multifaceted. And that makes risk assessment very hard. Risk assessment very hard. It makes rectifying those harms very difficult. I'd like to throw to Amanda here because I think from the RegTech
sorry, that was great, the expansion on harm, James and Tim. I was just going to also, I guess, in expanding further on the privacy rating system, perhaps as part of the rating system, one of the pieces that could be explored, obviously certification is one side, but maybe even no-go zones, similar to how it is in Canada. So, where certain parts, like you just wouldn't be able to access information for these reasons, or it just aligns that expectation that these are certain things that companies in Australia will not have access to, or this is it widens the scope and also narrows it at the same time. It provides clear guidelines, so that is an alternative as well, I do think.
I mean, one of the other options I've seen floated is the concept of a personal data vault and a personal AI that mediates between you and the companies or government agencies that you want to interact with and your data. The idea behind this is that it flips the balance of power. Rather than every company collecting your data and holding it in their systems, you hold a single copy of your data and you grant access to the different entities that you want to interact with. And so you maintain a complete copy of your own data, you hold on to that, and then ultimately you have control over who gets to access that and for what reason. This would be mediated by personal AI, which is technology that does not exist, but perhaps one day it might. It's more of a thought experiment at this point of how we might change that balance of power.
Yeah, it sounds really similar to kind of the basis for consumer data right as well, and granting access and allowing for that transfer of information. But at the end of the day, the information is yours, and you have to be allowing that transmission. So that's definitely really interesting.
That really is a fascinating line, as you say. It shifts the balance of power. It also keeps you in control of the current data that you would be interested in sharing to whomever.
Yeah.
So, and rather than you trying to chase all the entities that have your data out there somewhere in the world now, it's fully within your control, and others can be granted access or denied immediately, but you know what it is that they have. Exactly.
And it could all be fully audit logged. You could start building in logging that allows you to trace automated or semi-automated decisions. There are a lot of potential benefits there, but at present, the technology doesn't exist. That doesn't mean it won't exist fairly soon. Arguably, all of the components are there. The AI interface is what is lacking at the moment. But we are out of time.
We are indeed, and as a consequence of some flourishing conversations. So just wanting to thank all of our panelists here today for joining us, and for Sacha and James, foremostly for their research, but also walking us through it and providing us insights into the various thought processes and observations of the Australian consumer. So thank you very much for joining us, Amanda, Tim, in addition to your contributions, to FTI Consulting again for hosting us today, and for all of our guests for joining us live. Just a friendly reminder, our Auckland cohort are actually hosting a Knowledge Net event this coming Thursday, the 25th. So for those interested to chime in virtually, please feel free to do so. The topic, I understand, is a cybersecurity threat update. So feel free to jump on the IAPP website for further details. And one other reminder, just for our ANZ Summit call for proposals, the deadline is June the 13th. So again, feel free to jump on iapp.org just for some further details. But additionally, don't hesitate to contact myself or our lovely regional manager, Jim Campbell, on jcampbell@iapp.org should you have any specific questions about KnowledgeNet events, about the IAPP Summit, or anything privacy related. But again, thank you all for joining us today and hope to see you all again soon.
Thanks,
Bye,
everyone.
everyone.
Thanks so much.
Thanks to you too, Therese. Thank you.
Thanks, Therese.